And now it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Marisa Brown. We're all very lucky to call Marisa a neighbor, colleague, and friend. She's a talented scholar and educator, the Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage at Brown University, where she teaches historic preservation and cultural heritage, curates exhibits related to architecture and place, and develops the center's public programs. Marisa received her PhD from Yale and her MA from the University of Chicago. She has written articles on American architects Bertrand Goldberg, Stanley Tigerman, and M. Paul Friedberg, and last spring co-curated with 4 graduate students the Providence Album, Volume 1, which was an exhibition of the photographs of Harry Callahan and Carmel Vitullo of Providence in the 1960s. Please join me in welcoming Marisa Brown.
Thanks so much to PPS for inviting me to be here tonight to share some thoughts about changes in the field of preservation as I see them. I think it's important to begin with an acknowledgement that this building sits on occupied indigenous lands, specifically the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. I note, too, that the center where I work at Brown stands on a campus that drew its early life's blood from the African slave trade in the Americas. These acknowledgments commit us to a lifetime of difficult anti-racist work. Tonight, I'm going to share with you some thoughts about what I see as the significant changes within the field of preservation. Some of these changes may be familiar to you, as they are starting to move from the margins into mainstream preservation practice, and others may be new. Sometimes entire fields of practice hit an inflection point, and within the span of a decade can change more than they changed over the previous 50 years. This is often because some of the most fundamental assumptions about that field come into question. Things that were taken for granted are all of a sudden uncertain, and new practitioners enter the scene who bring new questions and new approaches to the work. I believe that the field of historic preservation and cultural heritage is at such a point now. I should start by telling you why I think preservation is so important. One thing that I think we assume is that the places we live in, work in, and travel through every day tell an accurate story about the history of that place. In reality, all that we have is such a tiny portion of all of the buildings, squares, gardens, markets, schools, and temples that we as a species have built over hundreds of thousands of years. The vast majority of the things we have built have been destroyed by fires, floods, desertion, destruction. So the things that we see do not tell us a whole lot about our history. What they do tell us about is which eras and which social groups have been deemed valuable by those who have had enough wealth and power to protect, conserve, and rehabilitate them. They are not a record of history. They are a record of particular groups' ideas about history. But I'm not sure that this insight is something that we're always aware of as we move through the built landscape. If the daily newspaper is the first draft of history, then the preserved city is like our final draft, as it becomes more challenging for us to truly absorb histories that are not visible in our landscape. This is why I believe that preservation is so important, because it has such a massive impact on how we think about our histories as a community and as a country. Preservation fights can be nasty. Neighbors can turn on each other, and community allies can find themselves on opposite sides when sometimes it seems like the stakes are so trivial in the context of the world that we live in. But I think that the stakes are actually quite high, and that these partisans know it, because we define ourselves and our culture through the act of preservation. Before we go on, I'd like to thank Jane Yakovone for allowing me to use her photograph here of the demolition of the Wickenden Street overpass in 2010 when I-195 was moved. I wanted to begin with it because to me it represents the cycle of creativity and destruction and the sense of loss that inspires us to preserve. I'm not going to try to give a history of the preservation movement in the United States. Instead, I'm going to give you two snapshots of important moments in the development of the field that I believe are important as they help us to see the context for change today. Can everyone read what's here, or do you need me to? No, people can't. Okay. So you can't see it. So on the left, and I'm going to tell you what they are. Let me read it, and I can then read the text up here. The first preservation projects in America were projects that protected George Washington's military headquarters in Newburgh, New York. So that's the photograph there on the left. And his home and farm, Mount Vernon in Virginia, on the right. It's important to note that both of these projects date from the 1850s, about 50 years after Washington's death. These are important places in the way that we choose to think about American history and illustrate the relationship between preservation and nation building, or preservation in the service of nation building. Next one. Skipping ahead 100 years, we come to the accelerated pace of urbanization and development in the 1950s. Let me just read what's on the beneath each photograph, because I'm not going to say it in the text. So on the left, that's the interstate highway. It says the interstate highway goes through Detroit, demolishing an historically black neighborhood in the 1950s. And on the right, the demolition of Boston's West End, also in the 1950s. So the accelerated pace of urbanization and development in the 1950s and the demolition that went with it, especially the highway and road infrastructure that was built to support the automobile. Just as the destruction of European cities during World War II precipitated the establishment of UNESCO in 1945, the scale of building and demolition during this period in the United States catalyzed support for the preservation movement. What had been a scattered citizen-led field of practice was institutionalized in 1949 with the creation of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and in 1966 with passage of the National Historic Preservation Act. The act created the National Register of Historic Places, the list of National Historic Landmarks, and state historic preservation offices. During this era, federal and state preservation offices and organizations were tasked with producing surveys, inventories, drawings, and photo documentation of America's most significant sites, not primarily for the good of the public, but for more specific public of local, state, and federal planners and public agency bureaucrats. These surveys, inventories, drawings, photographs, and reports were paperwork that could be used and considered alongside opposing paperwork that might argue for demolition of those sites to expedite the aims of urban renewal or large public works projects. This is how you turn the levers of government and how you might stop wholesale demolition of entire neighborhoods. As has been widely acknowledged, the standards that were developed to guide the selection and demarcation of sites that were worthy of preservation during this time favored buildings with well-known architects that retained enough of their original infrastructure to retain integrity. Next slide. One of my favorite series of photographs ever. One of the best-known images of the preservation movement at this time shows Jane Jacobs, Philip Johnson, and others protesting the 1963 destruction of the old Penn Station in suits and pearls. Ultimately, as we know, McKim, Mead, and White's beautiful station, completed in 1910, was lost. But this picture sums up the movement in the 1960s. Penn Station was a perfect example of the kind of building that the forces of preservation mobilized to try to protect in the mid-1960s. Next slide. This is blank. But times have changed. In the last 50 years, critical questions have emerged about the field around issues of power, justice, and equity, and attendant questions about what we choose to preserve, how, why, and who decides. Since the 1960s, the most significant development to impact the field has been the growing understanding that preservation, conservation, and heritage work are not neutral, objective fields of practice, but are shaped by ideology and are often used as tools to achieve specific ideological ends. What does that mean in practice? It means, next slide, I think. It means that the preservation of particular buildings and sites, and I'll tell you in the text what we're looking at in a second. It means that the preservation of particular buildings and sites can play a role in creating or extending some notion of national identity and culture. Preserved sites can operate like propaganda, not that they are false or tell false stories, but that they are designed to strengthen a particular point of view or set of ideas, especially national origin stories. We also now understand that preservation is an economic strategy that can be used to increase the monetary value of a place in order to extract wealth from it. This problem isn't confined to the United States. Beginning in the 1990s, international bodies like the World Bank and UNESCO brazenly began to treat cultural heritage sites as drivers of economic development. The heritage historian Neil Asher Silberman writes, like bauxite, coal, or rainforest hardwoods, the material remains of the past were seen as an economic resource. In many urban centers, this issue flares up through contentious conversations about the link among preservation, gentrification, and displacement. Studies on both sides show that historic district designations or other landmark protections can have negative, neutral, or positive impacts on communities, as measured by affordability and racial diversity. So there is no consensus yet on the impacts of preservation. But the perception remains that preservation works for business and cultural elites, and that the field has done little to affect positive change in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color that are bypassed because their building stock and cultural landscapes do not fit easily within the field's focus on material integrity and architectural pedigree. These kinds of conversations, we can go to the next slide. These kinds of conversations about how preservation works to extend power are increasingly happening in the field. The Association of Critical Heritage Studies, founded only about 10 years ago, brings together scholars and practitioners who are interested in asking, quote, many uncomfortable questions of traditional ways of thinking about and doing heritage, including its impact on the marginalized and excluded. What's interesting about the ACHS is who is joining. Look through its membership and you will find many graduate students and early career preservation and heritage professionals who are the future of the field. The journal Future Anterior, out of Columbia University's School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, takes a similar approach, asking critical questions about the assumptions, methods, goals, and results of mainstream preservation practice, and highlighting new and creative ways of doing this work. One of the most important new developments, next slide, in preservation over the last 20 years, I believe, is the emerging attention to preserving and interpreting what are being called sites of conscience. These are places that have some connection to difficult or hidden histories, including prisons, sites of the transatlantic slave trade, museums to political repression, as well as preserved tenement homes and other places that tell stories about the everyday life of non-elites. The International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, founded in 1999, played a central role in articulating the public significance of these sites of, quote, traumatic memory, and creating a framework to connect institutions that use these historic sites as the starting point for conversations about critical contemporary issues around human rights. In the US, this new trajectory is part of what Max Page calls, quote, a new commitment to uncovering the places of pain and shame in the American landscape, one of the most important developments in the historic preservation movement in the past 3 decades. So what I'm showing you here is some of the founding members of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. The organization began with 9 member institutions, which I'm showing you a few of here. The British National Trust, the District 6 Museum in South Africa, which focuses on the history of apartheid, the Gulag History Museum in Russia, the Jane Addams Hull House Museum in Chicago, the Maison des Esclaves in Senegal, which was built in 1776. It was an important site in the transatlantic slave trade and UNESCO's first World Heritage Site in Africa. Here I'm showing you 2 views, the bottom 2 photographs, and I'm sure many people will remember the moving photograph second to right of the Obamas when they visited the Maison des Esclaves and its door of no return. Next slide. And these are the other founding members. Memoria Aberta in Buenos Aires, which works to memorialize the disappeared in Argentina, the Tenement Museum in New York, the Ghetto Museum in Terezin in the Czech Republic, on the history of the Jewish ghetto under the Nazis, and the United States National Park Service. It has since grown to include over 250 member organizations around the world. What is significant about this new development is the overt recognition that heritage and power are closely linked, and that preservation work may be used to help dismantle unjust systems by shining a light on inequity. Rather than extending power, preservation can tell critical truths about the past, thereby assisting in building a more equitable future. Next slide. These are new sites. They're part of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which include the National Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, the Tule Lake National Monument in Newell, California, and the Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana. At the same time, older sites are reinterpreting their own histories, centering slavery and histories of enslaved people in their public tours, exhibitions, and programs, such as James Monroe's former plantation, Highland in Virginia, Monticello in Charlottesville, the Owens Thomas House in Savannah, and the Aiken Rhett House in Charleston. In addition, state historic preservation offices are surveying overlooked neighborhoods and sites, or revising old surveys to include sites of African American history or other underrepresented histories. Here in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island State Historic Preservation Office recently augmented and amended the College Hill Historic District documentation with 40-plus pages of amazing research on Providence's African American community with a grant from the National Park Service. This work is just beginning, especially for small nonprofits and local preservation offices that don't have the historians on staff or the resources to develop and execute new interpretive projects. The African American Cultural Heritage Fund, established by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2017, is one new and significant resource that will fund such work. But there are still so many challenges. Next slide. In addition to funding, one big challenge is how to preserve a site that no longer exists. The history of our built landscape begins with the displacement of indigenous communities by white settlers. Our own city, Providence, takes its shape from waves of displacement as well. Each act of displacement, whether intended or not, carried out by individuals and groups with more wealth and power than those displaced. Think about the demolition of large swaths of the south and west sides to make way for I-95, or the erasure of Snowtown, a 19th century poor, racially mixed neighborhood which included black homeowners and business people, covered over now by the grounds of the State House, Canal Street, and most recently a new condo development. So on the right, that's the part of the site of Snowtown now. On the left, for people who can't make that out, so this is a photograph that was only taken a few months ago. It's a selection of the 30,000 plus artifacts from Snowtown that have been uncovered in archaeological digs by the Public Archaeology Lab and the Department of Transportation. And so these are the archaeologist there, Heather Olson, has been doing a lot of research and work with these artifacts. It's sort of the only thing that we have that's left of this dynamic neighborhood. Most of us now recognize the systemic racism that has strategically demolished and displaced communities of color throughout our history. The challenge for preservationists, historians, and community leaders will be to figure out creative ways to mark these sites so that their histories can be encountered in public life. And I also want to reference back when Brent was talking about the Sites and Stories project. That's another way that I think PPS is really leading the way in doing some of this work and trying to figure out, how to mark and interpret these sites that don't exist anymore. Some might say that this is not the work of preservation, but of public history, but I disagree. If preservationists are relegated to working only to protect existing structures and spaces that remain relatively untouched by time and were constructed with long-lasting, often expensive materials, then the field cannot hope to be representative of all people. It will succeed only in protecting sites built by and for those with wealth and power. The field is simply going to have to change its methods of evaluation and its bias toward structures with integrity in order to participate, if it wants to participate, in telling a more accurate story about the past. So, preservation is becoming, I think, more of an interpretive practice. This has ramifications for preservation education, which I'll talk about in a second. Preservationists are becoming more attuned to ways in which their field has been complicit in concretizing elite white histories and cultures, and are now seeking to rectify this by working to preserve and better understand sites of conscience and buildings and cultural landscapes connected to marginalized communities. Next slide. As they do this work, interest is emerging in democratizing processes and programs by putting community participation at the center of the field. Referred to as public heritage or community heritage, this new publicly engaged practice generates projects based on community priorities, with community input and with outputs that give some measure of control to community collaborators. So far, archaeologists are ahead of historic preservationists in designing public heritage projects that are truly shaped by community participation and community goals. Although community engagement is becoming more and more integral to the work of preservation, old habits die hard, and it is often the case that community engagement means stirring up community support to preserve a building or space that a preservation organization has already deemed valuable, not working with a community to understand their goals and concerns, and then asking how preservation tools and resources might support these existing efforts. Next slide. What are models for doing public preservation that preservationists can look to? I find that a lot of the best thinking about these issues of community engagement are happening in museum practice, in contemporary art practice, and in the public humanities. Since the 1990s, participatory or social practice art has emerged as one of the most dynamic forms of artistic practice. Many artists working in this field see their work as a nexus of art making, community collaboration, activism, and performance, where the interaction between people in a place is the medium, just as paint is the medium of a painting. Without people, there is no artwork. A couple of examples of social practice art projects include Between the Door on the Street on the left, created by Suzanne Lacey in 2013, in which 400 women and men gathered on stoops along a block in Brooklyn talking about gender politics as thousands of members of the public walked the block, stopping to listen and to participate. Or on the right, a much better known and I think beloved project, Project Row Houses, begun by the artist Rick Lowe in 1993 in Houston's 3rd Ward. Lowe purchased and restored 22 shotgun houses and turned them into arts and community spaces, and continues to defy easy classification by offering studio space, free tutoring, residences for young mothers, and space for some of the most cutting-edge and interesting performance and public art. In both cases, these artists blur the lines between art making and community activism in ways that I think could inspire preservation today. Next slide. As preservation becomes more community-centered, preservationists will need to look outside of mainstream preservation practice to adjacent fields of archaeology, contemporary art, public history, and the public humanities for models of how to think about and do this work. This new kind of preservation practice requires skills and interests on the part of preservation organizations in the field of public history and the public humanities rather than just architecture, engineering, and the building sciences. Most graduate programs in historic preservation are housed in architecture schools and departments. These programs award an MS degree and usually require courses in architectural and preservation history and theory, conservation, building technologies, or preservation law and economics, with no required courses in the theories and methodologies of public history, public humanities, or museum studies. As preservation becomes more interpretive, more critical, more engaged with issues of equity and social justice, more experimental, and more participatory, the work of these fields becomes more essential. In my work at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Heritage, I see the next generation of public historians, public humanists, and preservationists. And one thing is clear, they will continue to push the field even further in these new directions, centering issues of power, justice, and equity, and finding creative ways to connect the work with local communities. I'll conclude with a course reflection written by one of our students at the end of our seminar on preservation. Preservation has the greatest potential to visibly decenter previous elite narratives and start conversations about history and memory at a local level, and has the potential to radically reshape what communities value. These are not things that the preservation machine was designed to do. Returning for a moment to the 1850s and the 1950s, it's important to remember that preservation has been used as a tool of nation building, as a tool to counter federal urban renewal mega projects, and a tool to concretize the culture of white elites, not entirely, but for the most part. Now we are asking preservation to do different things, to be more radical. And it's a little bit like rebuilding the boat while we are all on the open seas. How can historic sites become places that catalyze reflections about power? Can preserved sites become agents that are resistant, oppositional spaces, co-created with communities? What are heritage sites and objects that tell the story of environmental destruction? And how might we preserve and interpret them to create a public history of climate change? What are heritage objects that tell the story of gentrification, including the role of preservation in sometimes extending displacement? How might activists advance their aims by centering issues of equity around the demolition or preservation of particular places and sites? These were not the questions of preservation practice in the past, but they are the questions of tomorrow. Last slide. Preservation grapples with the big questions about history, about culture, and about power. That's why it's so interesting. It's also why it's so important. We're here to celebrate the work of PPS tonight and the organization's commitment to preservation education. Providence has always played an outsized role in shaping preservation practice, just as PPS has played an outsized role in shaping Providence. Brent, Rachel, Kelsey, Angela, Kate, and Mark, I value working with all of you so much in all of the ways that we work together throughout the years and projects and in coursework, our conversations. I think all of us here thank you for the work that you do. I know we thank you for the work that you do. And we look forward to continuing to support you as you show the rest of the country and the other 49 how it's done.